sea was flat that morning off the coast of what the Portuguese then called the Costa Verde, somewhere below the mouth of a river the charts had not yet learned to name. A caravel, the São Cristóvão, was becalmed under a low grey sky, her sails hanging slack, her crew hauling the sounding line to find a bottom that kept refusing to answer. And then the water beside the hull changed. Not broke, not splashed. Changed, the way a floor changes when something enormous shifts beneath a carpet. A man named Duarte, a cartographer of no great fame who had been sent aboard to correct the coastal outlines, was standing at the rail with a board of paper braced against his forearm. He would later write that he first thought the ship had drifted over a reef because a long, dark ridge was rising out of the calm, glistening, sectioned, running the length of 3 or 4 oars, end to end. But reefs do not rise. This one lifted itself clear of the surface in a slow, deliberate arch, and the water sheeted off a back that was ridged like the spine of some vast plough beast, each ridge tipped with a paler crest, the whole of it the colour of wet slate going green where the light struck it. It was not a whale. Every man aboard had seen whales. Whales are smooth, and they roll, and they blow. This did not roll. It coiled. The back that had risen beside the bow was, Duarte realized with a horror he could barely commit to ink, only one loop of a body that continued forward and continued aft, so that a second arch of the same creature broke the surface nearer the stern, and between the 2 arches lay a length of ship hull and a half of water that the animal occupied unseen beneath. He counted the ridges. He wrote the number down, 7 above the water on the forward coil. He did not know how many lay below. Then the head came up. He gave it perhaps 4 lines of description, and I have read those 4 lines more times than I can count, because they are the calmest 4 lines in the whole document, and that calm is the most frightening thing about them. The head, he wrote, was longer than a man is tall, flattened along the top like the head of a great eel, with a seam of a mouth that ran back past where the eyes should be. The eye that faced him he described as dark and lidless and set forward, not to the side as a fish's eye sits, but forward, the way the eyes of a thing that hunts by looking are set. It regarded the ship. That is his phrase. It regarded the ship. What happened next happened in the time it takes to draw a breath and let it out. 2 sailors had been leaning over the waist of the vessel, one to see, the men said afterward, the other to be sick because the smell that came off the animal was the smell of the deep places, of things brought up dead in nets from far below. The head dipped, unhurried, almost gentle, and took them. Not lunged, took. The mouth opened along that long seam and closed over the rail and a section of planking and the 2 men who had been leaning there, and when it slid back into the water, the rail was gone and the men were gone, and there was a wound in the ship's side the length of a door. There was no scream that anyone could later agree on. There was a sound, they said, but no one would name it. Duarte kept drawing. That is the detail that made me spend 3 weeks inside this material before I wrote a single word. A man watches a creature swallow 2 of his shipmates and tear a hole in the vessel, keeping him alive above 400 fathoms of water, and his hands keep moving across the paper because he understood, I think he understood in that moment better than anyone on deck, that no one on land would ever believe a word of it unless the shape was on the page. So he drew the coils as they sank. He drew the way the ridges submerged in sequence, forward loop first, then the long middle, then the aftermost arch, the whole animal pouring itself back down into the dark in one continuous, unhurried motion, like a rope being drawn through a hole in the sea. He noted the time by the watch. He noted the depth the sounding line had failed to find. And in the margin, in a hand that the later copyists preserved because they did not dare alter it, he wrote 3 words in Portuguese that translate, roughly, to "it was real." Not a devil, not a portent, not a punishment sent for the sins of the crew, though a priest aboard would insist on all 3 before the voyage ended. A cartographer, a man whose entire profession was the disciplined refusal of imagination, a man paid to draw only what could be measured and placed, looked at the thing in the water and reached for the vocabulary of an animal. Ridges, head, eye, length. He measured it against the ship because the ship was the only ruler he had. And when he was finished, he had produced not a myth, but a field sketch. The first, I would argue, of dozens that would be made across the next 2 centuries by men who never met each other, who sailed under different flags, who could not have copied one another, and who nonetheless drew the same impossible animal again and again along the same cold edges of the same charts. Because here is the thing the museums will not tell you when you stand in front of a Renaissance map and smile at the serpent coiled in the empty ocean, the one with the arched back and the forward-set eye and the 7 ridges rising from the water. You have been taught your whole life that those creatures were decoration, ornament. A cartographer filling dead space, warning sailors away from the unknown with pretty monsters, the visual equivalent of "here be dragons." That is what I was taught too. That is what the caption cards say. That is what the art historians repeat. I no longer believe it. And by the time I had followed Duarte's ridged animal off the edge of his ruined chart and onto a dozen others, from the fjords of Norway to the volcanic shelf of the Azores, matched to strandings, to bite-scarred whales, to Inquisition testimony that was burned precisely because it described the thing too plainly, I had stopped believing it entirely. The monsters on the old maps were not warnings about the unknown, they were records of the known. Someone stood at a rail as Duarte stood at his and watched and counted the ridges and wrote down what took the men beside him. What we have to answer now is where it came from, how far it ranged, and where exactly it went. Start with the Norwegian evidence because it is the oldest and the most stubborn. In the archiepiscopal records at Nidaros, later folded into the great compilation that Olaus Magnus published at Rome in 1555, there is a description of a creature the coastal fishermen of Hålogaland called by a name that translates, roughly, as the mast serpent, a beast of enormous length, dark on the back and pale beneath, that rose in still weather with a series of coils or humps standing clear of the water, and a head held high and forward on a thick neck. Olaus drew it. You have seen his drawing, or its descendants. It is the one wrapped around a ship, jaws at a sailor. Dismiss the wrapping as an engraver's drama if you like. But hold the anatomy against Duarte's field sketch made 18 years earlier and a full ocean away, off a coast Olaus never sailed and in a language he could not read. The ridges, the forward-set eye, the dark dorsal line broken into standing humps. 2 men, 2 seas, no contact, 1 animal, then move south and forward. The Carta Marina's serpent recurs, subtly redrawn, on the maps of Sebastian Münster, on the sea charts issued out of Antwerp in the 1560s, on Dutch pilot books that were working documents, not art, books whose entire purpose was to keep a captain alive, in which a single false sounding could sink a crew, and into which no serious pilot would insert a decorative fantasy any more than a modern aviator would sketch a cartoon into a runway approach plate. And yet, there it is, in the margins where the depth notes cluster, off the Faro bank, off the Rockall rise, along the cold shelf edges where warm current meets cold, and the water suddenly goes from soundable to bottomless. Always the same edges, always the same animal. I spent 3 weeks laying these maps over one another on a light table, and what emerged was not the scatter you would expect from independent inventions. It was a distribution. The creature clustered where the deep water climbed toward the shallow, the exact frontier where deep-ranging predators drive their prey against the wall of the continental slope today. And the strandings answer the sketches. In the parish annals of the Norwegian coast, in the Icelandic annals kept at Skalholt, in scattered English and Portuguese port records, there is a thin but persistent line of entries describing long-bodied carcasses cast up after storms, bodies that did not match a whale, that had no baleen and no clear flukes, that were described as ridged along the spine and set with a row of what the writers called fins or manes or spines, and that rotted so fast the men who tried to preserve them were left with nothing but a stinking ruin of cartilage and a memory. One entry, from the Trøndelag coast and dated to the winter of 1656, records such a body measured at 31 ells, better than 50 feet, and notes, in a detail no inventor would bother with, that the flesh was already gone soft when it landed, as though the animal had died deep and risen slowly. Deep water animals do that. They come up bloated and half dissolved from a pressure their tissue was never meant to leave. The carcass that cannot be identified and cannot be kept is the signature of something that lives below the reach of the men who find it. Now, the whales. This is the detail that stopped me cold, the one I keep returning to. In the logs of the northern whalers, Basque, then Dutch, then English, working the same grounds for 3 centuries, there are repeated notations of sperm whales and right whales taken bearing scars. Not the round sucker marks of a giant squid, which the whalers knew well and named without alarm. These were different, long parallel gouges, and worse, great crescent bites taken clean out of the flank or the fluke, wounds the men estimated by the span of a boat's beam and could not reconcile with any predator they could name. A predator that scars a full-grown sperm whale is not a fantasy of frightened sailors. A sperm whale is 60 tons of muscle that dives to a mile and fights. Whatever opened those crescents in its flesh was hunting in the same dark the whale hunted in, and was large enough and armed enough to try for the whale itself. The maps drew the animal. The whales carried the tooth marks, and then the record does something that a myth never does. It goes quiet in a way that looks like fear. In the Inquisition archives of Lisbon and of the Canaries there survive fragments, summaries, really, of documents that no longer exist, noting that certain seamen's depositions concerning a great sea beast were suppressed, and in at least 2 cases that the testimony itself was ordered burned, because to describe such a creature as God's ordinary work was one thing, but to describe it as the men actually described it, as a thing that reasoned, that circled the ship, that took chosen men and left others, edged toward heresy, toward the sin of populating God's ocean with a devil. So the plainest accounts, the ones closest to what Duarte scrawled on his deck, were precisely the ones fed to the fire. What survives in the maps is the censored version. The uncensored version was destroyed for being too clear. Assemble it, and a shape emerges that is not a legend but a life history. A large, long-bodied, deep-water predator, dark-backed and ridged, that ranged the cold North Atlantic from the Norwegian fjords to the Azorian shelf, that followed the same cold frontier the old trade routes were forced to follow, that surfaced in calm weather and in the twilight where its prey rose, and that intersected with human beings only where their ships crossed its hunting edge. It was not everywhere. It was where the deep water came close, and the herring and the squid and the whales gathered, and the medieval and Renaissance sea lanes, hugging the shelf, running the coasts, threading the very banks where the cold upwelled, those lanes ran straight through its kitchen, which is why the last part of this is the strangest, and the reason I could not let the subject go. The creature does not fade slowly from the charts. It vanishes almost on a date. As the 18th century turns, as the deep-sounding lead and then the sounding line reach down and begin to map the bottom, as the trade routes swing away from the cold shelf and out into the open crossing that steam would later make standard, the ridged animal simply stops appearing. The new hydrographic charts, drawn by men who prided themselves on scrubbing every superstition from the sea, show clean water where the serpent used to coil. The animal did not become a myth. The route left it. The soundings pushed it down. And along the abyssal edge, where the last careful cartographer set his final depth note and lifted his pen, something the maps had recorded for 200 years went dark and stayed there. So follow it down, not into legend, into water, into the specific, measurable place the animal would have gone, and the specific, measurable reason it would have gone there. The North Atlantic did not stay the sea it was in 1537. The centuries that carried Europe from the caravel to the steamship were the centuries of what climatologists now call the Little Ice Age, a long, cold anomaly that reached its coldest floor between roughly 1650 and 1715. The cold frontier the old roots hugged, the upwelling shelf edge where warm and cold water meet and life stacks up in the twilight, that frontier shifted. It moved. It deepened. The herring shoals that had for 1,000 years crowded the Norwegian and Icelandic coasts collapsed and reorganized. The great herring periods, documented in Bohuslän fishery records, blinked on and off across exactly these decades. A predator tuned to that frontier does not disappear when the frontier moves. It moves with it, and if the frontier moves down into colder, deeper, darker water, then so does the animal, out of the surface twilight where a man on a deck could see it, and into the layer where no man on a deck ever could. That is the first pressure. Cooling seas, sinking prey, an animal following its food away from the light. The second pressure is us. Consider what the 18th and 19th centuries did to the upper ocean. We did not merely sail across it, we stripped it. The systematic hunting of the great whales, the near extermination of the North Atlantic right whale and the sperm whale populations that had ranged these same banks, the collapse of the cod and the herring under industrial nets, an entire mid-water food column that had stood in place since before the Romans was pulled out from underneath any large predator that depended on it. Dredged waters. Emptied waters. The kitchen the caravels had blundered through was, over 4 or 5 generations, quietly cleaned out. A specialist hunter of the cold shelf edge, already retreating downward with the cold, would find the shallow world that had sustained it going silent, and it would go where the food still was, down, into the crushing dark of the continental slope, the 800, the 2,000, the 4,000 meters where the squid still swarm in numbers no net has ever reduced, where the whale carcasses still fall, where the light has never been, and the pressure would kill any of us in a heartbeat. There is nothing supernatural in this. It is the ordinary arithmetic of a large animal outliving the conditions that once brought it into human sight. We did not kill it. We may simply have stopped meeting it. The encounter was always an accident of overlap, its hunting edge crossing our sailing edge, and we broke the overlap ourselves by cooling, by dredging, by swinging our roots off the shelf and out into the deep blue crossing where the water below the keel is not 400 fathoms but 4,000, and nothing rises to be seen. Now I owe you the sober answer because it is a good one and I have spent a long time with it. The careful skeptic, and I have read them, the marine zoologists, the historians of cartography, the men who catalogued every mapped monster and matched it to a mundane original. The skeptic says this: there was no single animal, there was never a beast. What the maps preserve is a composite of ordinary things misread by frightened, exhausted, half-starved men. The ridged back is a line of porpoises surfacing in file, a trick of perspective that has fooled competent observers into the 20th century. The vast coiling body is the oarfish, Regalicus glesne, a genuine animal that reaches 11 meters, ribbon-thin and silver with a crimson crest, that rises dying to the surface and writhes exactly as a serpent is imagined to writhe. The blunt head and the blowing spray is a whale. The thing that ate 2 men is a rogue wave, a capsizing, a drowning rationalized after the fact into a monster because a monster is easier to carry home than an accident. And the maps agree with one another, the skeptic finishes, not because they saw the same animal, but because they copied one another. Cartographers borrowed freely. Olaus Magnus fed Mercator fed Ortelius, and one persuasive engraving propagates across a century of charts like a rumour with a coastline. I find this persuasive. I want you to hear that I find it persuasive because a story like this one is only worth telling if the teller has genuinely tried to kill it. The oarfish is real, and it is uncanny, and it explains a great deal. The porpoise file is real. The copying is real and documented. You can trace the visual lineage of specific monsters from plate to plate and watch the same fin migrate across 60 years of atlases. If you want a floor under your feet, that answer is the floor, and it holds most of the weight, but it does not hold all of it, and the part it cannot hold is the part I keep returning to in the dark. Copying explains why maps resemble each other. It does not explain the independent ones. It does not explain the Portuguese pilot's log that never entered print, sketched at sea in 1537 by a man who had never seen Olaus Magnus and never would, matching a Norwegian church carving he could not have known existed. It does not explain the Inquisition depositions, taken separately, under oath, from illiterate crews who could not have coordinated their lie, and were burned precisely because they would not recant a description that agreed too well with others they had never met. It does not explain the bite-scarred whales hauled up on beaches from Shetland to the Azores with parallel gouges spaced too wide for any documented shark. Oarfish do not bite whales. Porpoise files do not leave scars. Panic does not draw the same ridged back, the same dark dorsal line, the same manner of surfacing in calm and sounding in one long coil from a dozen witnesses across 4 languages and 200 years who had no way to teach it to one another. That is the residue the good answer leaves on the glass, not the monsters that were copied, the ones that were not and still match. So I leave you where the last cartographer left his pen. Somewhere on an 18th century hydrographic chart, out along the slope where the shelf falls away into the true abyss, a careful man wrote his final sounding, a number, a depth, a small, honest note in iron gall ink, and then the measured water ends and the blank begins. He scrubbed the serpents out. He was proud to. And in doing so, he drew, without meaning to, the exact boundary of the thing he was denying, the line where our light stops and its darkness starts, the edge below which we simply stopped looking down. The seas are colder in the deep now than they were when a Portuguese cartographer's hand shook on a rolling deck and he sketched the coiling shape that had just taken 2 of his shipmates. The roots have long since moved, the soundings long since pushed it down, and I cannot tell you it is dead. I can only tell you that every map agreed on its shape, that the men who saw it paid for the sighting, and that along the abyssal edge where the ink stops, 4,000 meters beneath the clean blue crossing we take for empty, something the charts recorded for 2 centuries went quiet and was never, by us, seen to die. Consider what that silence actually is, not proof of absence. The absence of proof, which in the deep sea are not the same thing, and never have been. We have mapped the surface of Mars to a resolution finer than we have mapped the floor of our own Atlantic. We have sent more human beings to the summit of Everest than to the bottom of the Puerto Rico Trench. The abyssal slope where the last cartographer stopped his ink is, to this day, less visited than the far side of the moon. When people tell you the ocean has been explored, they mean the top of it, they mean the crossing, they mean the 200 meters of sunlit water in which we swim and fish and drown. Below that lies a volume so vast that if you emptied every museum drawer and every trawl net and every submersible dive we have ever made into it, you would have sampled a fraction of 1%. And it is in that unsampled dark that a migratory predator following cold water down as the surface warmed would go, not extinct, but simply out of reach, out of the light, off the edge of the only kind of looking we know how to do. I spent a long time, near the end of this, sitting with a single document I have not yet described to you. It is held in Lisbon, in the Arquivo Histórico Ultramarino, and it is not a map. It is a letter, written by a pilot named Duarte Fernandes in the autumn of 1571, addressed to a superior he clearly feared. In it, he apologizes. He apologizes for a delay, for a lost cargo, and for what he calls, in the plain Portuguese of a working seaman, o mal do mar fundo, the evil of the deep sea. He describes losing a man over the side in flat calm, no wind, no wave, the water, he writes, opening beneath the boat like a mouth and closing again with nothing on it. And then he writes one line that I have not been able to put down. He writes that he did not report it in full because the last pilot who reported such a thing in full was questioned by men who were not sailors and never given another ship. That is the whole machinery of the erasure, confessed in a single sentence by a frightened man 450 years ago. Not a conspiracy, a career. He stayed quiet to keep his living, and in staying quiet, he thinned the record by one more sighting, and the thinning of the record is precisely why you were taught the serpents were decoration. Multiply Duarte Fernandez by every pilot who chose his livelihood over his testimony. Multiply him by every Inquisition clerk who filed a sea monster deposition under heresy and let it burn with the rest. Multiply him by every 19th century hydrographer who inherited a chart full of coils and scrubbed them off as an embarrassment before republishing under his own respectable name. You do not need anyone to hide the truth. You only need each individual person acting reasonably to find it slightly inconvenient to preserve. That is how a real animal becomes a superstition. Not with a cover-up, with 1,000 small acts of tidying. And so the creature did not vanish the way a species vanishes. It vanished the way a rumor does when the people who carry it are shamed into silence one by one. The last maps to draw it did not draw it because they had stopped seeing it. They stopped drawing it because seeing it had become unprofessional. The water did not change. We did. We decided, somewhere in the long, cold rationalizing of the 18th century, that the sea was a surface to be crossed and not a depth to be feared, and we drew our charts to match the decision, and the depth kept its own counsel below the ink. I want to be honest with you about how this ends for me, because I promised you restraint, and I will not abandon it now. I cannot show you a body. There is no jar in a museum with the ridged coil of the thing suspended in spirit, no photograph steady enough to end the argument, no skeleton laid out on a slope of cotton wool with a catalogue number I could give you to check. If there were, it would not be a mystery, and I would not have spent 3 months of my life inside these documents unable to sleep. What I have is worse than a body and less than a body at the same time. I have agreement. I have a dozen independent hands, separated by language, by century, by faith, by ocean, who never met and never could have, drawing the same animal, the same dark dorsal line, the same manner of rising in the calm, the same long single coil in the sounding, and paying for the drawing with their reputations or their lives. I have whales with parallel scars no living mouth accounts for. I have a pilot's confession that the record was thinned on purpose, for reasons that had nothing to do with truth, and I have the edge of the ink, so go and look. The maps are real, and most of them are public. The Carta Marina is in Uppsala, the Ribeiro charts are digitized, the Ultramarino letters can be requested. Pull the bite scar strandings from the 19th century natural history journals and measure the gouges yourself against every shark jaw ever recorded, and find, as I did, that the spacing does not fit. I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to notice that the tidying is visible, that you can watch the serpents disappear from edition to edition of the same chart, drawn by frightened men and erased by proud ones, until the water goes blank and you are taught the blankness was always there. And then think of the deck. Think of 1537, the caravel rolling under a grey Atlantic sky, a cartographer with ink on his fingers, and 2 empty places at the rail where his shipmates had stood a moment before. Think of the vast ridged back rising alongside the hull, close enough that he could see the dark line running down it, close enough to sketch, and then the long coil, and then nothing, the water closing the way Duarte Fernandez said it closed, like a mouth, over a surface that showed no sign it had ever opened. He drew what he saw because he did not yet know he was not allowed to. He was among the last men on earth permitted to be honest about the deep before honesty became superstition and superstition became silence. The roots have moved, the seas have cooled below and warmed above and pushed the cold water shape down past the reach of our nets and our light and our nerve. The ink stops 4,000 meters above a floor we have barely touched. And the question the cartographer left on that rolling deck, the question every erased map asks in the same silent hand, is the one I cannot answer and will not pretend to. If they all saw the same thing, and they did, then what is still down there in the dark below the last sounding, moving along the edge where our looking ends? We stopped drawing it, we never saw it die, and the water has kept its counsel ever since.